Hi, my name is Amira Shoei Bedawi, and I am a professional certified coach from the International Coaching Federation. I specialize in leadership, well-being, and occupational burnout. So as 2022 comes to an end, I like to reflect on the year. And when I go back to January, I remember some of us being hopeful. A lot of people were vaccinated. The mask mandate was either lessening or lifted completely. And eventually people returned to traveling, and there was this push to go back to normalcy. But of course the year wasn't void of stress. We started it off with a war that had global implications. Most economies are experiencing inflation and stagnation at the same time. And most organizations are pushing their employees to go back to the office full time after 2 years of living our entire lives at home. This led to the Great Resignation and a tidal wave of the quiet quitting. But it's not surprising that 2022 would have its own unique stressors. Of course, we all know the saying, the only constant in life is change, and therefore the only constant in life is stress, because stress is how we respond to change, how our body responds to change, whether it is a physical or psychological response. The thing is, if we dissect stress, we would find that in the heart of it lies emotions, and more specifically, the emotion of fear. And I think most of us would call fear a bad emotion, or at least we wouldn't call it a good one. And we have taken to categorizing emotions good or bad. But the reality is there are no good emotions and bad emotions. They're just emotions. They are indicators from our minds, trying to attract our attention to something that needs a response from us. This is what emotions are. Yet, we are taught to look at them as good and bad. And I think the good and bad part comes from how these emotions make us feel or make the people around us feel. So maybe a better description of fear would be that it's an uncomfortable emotion. It makes us feel uncomfortable. And I don't think anybody likes to feel fearful. Even fear junkies, they're not chasing the fear, they are chasing the excitement of being in fearful situations. Disgust, who likes to feel disgust? Nobody does. I mean, especially if we start to feel it physically, we feel nausea, we want to throw up, it's horrible. And when it comes to an emotion as anger, although the person experiencing anger might not feel uncomfortable, but the chances are somebody around you is going to feel uncomfortable with how you express this anger, regardless of the expression. At least one person is going to be uncomfortable with that expression of anger. So when we label emotions as good and bad, inherently we're kind of taught that we need to gravitate towards the good emotions and away from the bad ones. And this might translate to suppressing or masking these bad emotions. And this is where the discomfort comes from. Again, let's go back to emotions as an indicator. Something happens, so our mind will send us an indicator as an emotion to attract our attention to this thing so that we can take a proper response. So it's kind of like an alarm. In the beginning, it's just a beep saying, hey, you need to really focus on this thing that's happening and respond to it appropriately. What happens when we ignore this alarm? It just starts to get louder and more intense and therefore more uncomfortable. So this is where the discomfort comes from. It doesn't come from the emotion. It happens when we ignore the emotion. The thing is, all emotions, and especially the uncomfortable ones, they have a functional purpose. And this purpose is our survival. We feel fear when something threatens our survival, when there's a threat. And our automatic response to fear is to either run away from this threat or fight it if we feel that we can overcome it. When we feel disgust, our automatic response is to distance ourselves from the source of disgust. We feel anger when something that is precious to us or someone who is important to us is threatened. And our automatic response is to protect this precious thing or important person. So again, we are driven to take an action that is important to our survival. And this is why we have emotions. So the sooner we can identify this indicator and take an appropriate response, the less discomfort we will feel. And we might not feel any discomfort at all. So as we start 2023, what are we supposed to do with stress? How are we supposed to deal with stress? Because we know that stress is going to happen. Why? Because the only constant in life is change. So we're going to be stressed in 2023. This is not a surprise. I would say when you feel stressed, you need to befriend your stress, to sit with these uncomfortable emotions, and to start describing them with a lot of details. Research has found that the more granular you describe your emotions, the better your response to these incidents that are causing the emotions. And when I say granular, I'm not talking about, language labels that we use to describe a certain emotion. So it's not about saying, oh, I'm feeling trepidation or frustration or intimidation. From a language perspective, these labels have a meaning. But this isn't how we describe our emotions in details. It's about describing what we are feeling in that moment. So the first thing you need to do is to drop into your body and ask yourself, what is going on? What am I feeling? And describing it in as many details as possible. So let's take a common expression, feeling a knot in our stomach. We would use this expression with probably fear, excitement, and anger. But the thing is, this knot, when feeling fear, is not the same when feeling excitement. It's not the same when feeling anger. It'll feel different. So the more details we can use when describing this knot and this incident of emotion, the better we can come up with a response. So if I were to say that I feel a heavy, sharp knot in my stomach, and my breath is catching at the top of my throat, and my heart is pounding, and it needs to escape my chest. This is what I mean by describing our emotions in details. And the next step would to ask ourselves, what does this mean to Amira or to you? What is this incident of emotion? What does it say? What is it trying to communicate? And the more frequent you sit with these uncomfortable emotions, and the longer you sit with these uncomfortable emotions, the better you become at identifying these incidents. So eventually I'll be able to say, oh, well, all of these things indicate fear, but not any kind of fear. This indicates the fear that I feel when I get hopeful, for example. And it's very different than the fear that I feel on a roller coaster, or the fear that I feel when I'm in a dark alley at night alone. They're all incidents of fears, but they're different. And this is the fear that I feel when I get hopeful. So the next step would be to ask yourself, is this a real threat or a perceived one, an imaginary threat? Now, if it's an imaginary threat, I just need to remind myself that this is not real. I'm perceiving this as a threat because of whatever the reason. It could be a limiting belief. It could be just habit, business as normal, old patterns. It could be a cognitive distortion. It could be anything. So I just need to remind myself this is an imaginary threat and it's happening because of these reasons. And this is how I want to respond to this imaginary threat. So instead of running away, I am going to firmly assert my boundaries, for example. Or I am going to continue to move forward. I am not going to allow this perceived threat to stop me from achieving my goal. If it is a real threat, we need to look into our bag of psychological resources and ask ourselves, which resources do I need to use in this situation in order to respond to this real threat? And then I come up with a strategy to dealing with this threat. And this is how we respond to the threat, and this is how we can lessen the discomfort of stress. Of course, I understand that this is easier said than done. And this is why people work with coaches. Whether it's a burnout coach, a well-being coach, a resilient coach, any coach can help you learn these skills and also can help you to apply these skills constantly in your life and also to deal with drawbacks and pitfalls that will happen along the way because it's a normal part of the process. But these are important skills that we really need to learn how to develop and how to use in our lives. And that's it. So this is the end of our final episode of 2022. I know that it's been a bumpy road. There were certain topics that I said I was going to address and I didn't get to, and I don't really release episodes at set intervals. But life is unpredictable, and I think it makes sense that a podcast about burnout and how to deal with burnout would be unpredictable. And the more I think about it, I feel like being unpredictable is a means to being resilient, because it's very difficult to know how we're going to react at a certain situation, because it depends on a lot of things. It depends on who we are at that moment in time and what kind of psychological resources we have, what kind of support. It depends on the situation. It depends on the kind of stress that we're carrying. So it depends on a lot of things. So maybe being unpredictable is how we embrace our well-being and we work on our resilience. Maybe, but I don't know. I want to thank everybody who has tuned in, and I wish you all a happy and blessed and healthy 2023.